Thank you very much for your time, your diligence. I really appreciate your reporting because it is very much so unbiased. I just wanted to say that I very much so appreciate your work. And uh, if you ever decide to go back to Ukraine, um, we could do a situation where if I'm in the country at the same time and I have some leave saved up, um, I could probably maybe travel with you.
G'day legends, today's interview is with what we'll call Soldier W. Now, he has not participated in the war since the 24th of February 2022, but he was participated as a combatant on the Ukrainian side pre this in the years leading up, and is recently back upskilling to return to Ukraine in a different capacity. Now, as with everything online, take everything with a grain of salt. I'm here to give you maybe some different opinions and present some different stuff, but you know, your own research and whatever is needed to, I guess, make sense of this and where it lies. So don't, with everything online, don't take everything as, you know, that is the truth and answer. But I, as always, will try and present maybe different standpoints, people with different knowledge bases than I, and we'll try and get a picture of this as we go. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But otherwise, thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast. Thank you.
Gonna go if you're
Oh, sweet.
go.
Yeah. Well, mate. Firstly, thank you for coming and chatting to me and reaching out. And you know, we've been chatting about this for a while. I think it's been my end that's been busy delaying things or whatever. But mate, thank you for coming and having a talk to me.
Oh, no problem. Glad to be here, be able to talk, maybe offer some insights. Definitely always nice to get the perspectives of our friends from abroad.
Yeah, for sure, man. Now, I just really want to start with, I guess, what's your background with Ukraine and when you've been there and what the go is there for you?
Yeah, so my time in Ukraine started in 2018 and in about 2020 in terms of my time in the country. Beforehand, I had kept a close eye on the conflict since 2014 due to the fact that I was living in Europe when the conflict first started. And I had maintained active contact and interest in the conflict and in that region really since my time living in Europe, and have not been back to Ukraine since the invasion started. And I think that's something we'll probably get into during the topic of our conversation. It kind of correlates with a lot of things probably other foreigners have experienced in Ukraine or seen firsthand. And I've talked with a few that have been there since the invasion that have had similar issues, specifically guys that preemptively entered the country before the war began. So that's my initiating bid.
Yeah. So why did you go there initially?
So really what it came down to was a desire to see combat, and to participate in that is very much so seen as a rite of passage growing up. And in conjunction with the 2014 events, grasping my initial interest of the history in the region, why was there a flare up here? A lot of that occurred due to my proximity to the Ukraine. Furthermore to that point, I had many friends growing up that were joining the U.S. military. They weren't getting deployments. They weren't really getting what they wanted out of it. I had known some guys that had gone into Syria to fight ISIS at that point. So that's really where I first came into contact with the concept of foreign fighters, was really more so the guys going to Syria to fight, just due to the fact that Syria has been an active conflict for a little bit longer than Ukraine in terms of active, conventional, non-conventional warfighting. And I knew that I had a very deep interest in Ukraine from the start. And it was, when looking at all the options, I saw Ukraine definitely as a place where I could integrate. It was a place where I could learn the language and try and offer value, but at the same time really achieve some of those rites of passage that a lot of young men look for as they're going through adolescence. And so that's really where my start with going over to Ukraine began.
Right. And was that sort of scratch itched for that combat?
Yes, there was a lot for that, but also a lot just to have somewhat of an adventure of my own, to a large degree. And the time that I actually went over, the most active part of the fighting that occurred in 2014, 15, and 16 had mostly dissipated from very large battles and company-sized movements to mostly platoon movements. If you got lucky, there was a company-sized operation. But for me, the way I saw it is that regardless of the state of conflict, Ukraine was definitely a place that I had interest in going to at that point. Regardless of the state of the conflict, being able to join the military and obtain citizenship through military service to me was an attractive option, because if I was in a country and somebody was trying to become a citizen of it, it would be one of the more respectful ways to do that through serving the country itself through service.
Yeah.
If that kind of makes sense. Citizenship through service. Starship Troopers there's a reference.
Yeah, no, for sure. That definitely makes sense. But what do you think actually sparked the interest in Ukraine?
I think the primary thing that really sparks not just my interest, but the interests of other foreigners that went, specifically guys that were going over before, is that there is a very unique history in Ukraine. It's a very old place. I mean, if you look at the span of history, people have been in the Ukrainian region for a very long time. But to be honest, Ukraine, when it came to comparing it to, say, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, before the Maidan Revolution, it wasn't significantly different from any of those post-Soviet institutions. I think the spirit of the revolution from the Maidan events really captured a lot of people, and seeing that spirit, and especially, I guess it might be ingrained somewhat from an American psyche, given the waters in which our country was founded. And a lot of those things really help to capture a flame of interest. And I think in addition to seeing a lot of, correlations with American culture and society, that even Ukrainian society has components of that are fairly interesting. And it's, for example, the big one is that in the U.S. there is a militia culture, a culture of paramilitarism, if you want to word it that way, from the founding of our country all the way up until current day, where you have everything from independent groups all the way to state defense forces. And really the concept going back from a Anglo-Celtic, or particularly Anglo-Saxon point of view, is that of the feared, where people at home are armed, so that way when their country is attacked, they can be called up in short order to defend it. And Ukrainians actually have a very similar kind of culture that exists in that way there, but that's just one example of a mindset that is similar. I think also another thing that kind of speaks very powerfully to an American psyche, specifically when you're looking at this from that point in time, is that how different is this from the U.S. founding when we were trying to break away from Britain. And Ukraine is going through a lot of the same struggles where when we were trying to break away from the United Kingdom, same religion, same language, same cultural heritage, Ukraine faces a lot of the same issues to where in their fight for independence, they're oftentimes invalidated by their enemy, Russia, based on the fact that they share so many cultural, lingual, and historical ties. So I think these are different expressions of the way post-Maidan Ukraine thought, felt, and acted that really attracted a lot of people, especially early on.
Yeah, that's you did put that in a really good breakdown about the attraction for that.
Yeah, it's really one of those things where Ukraine, especially post-Maidan, was an extremely free society in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, Wild Westish, but more so in the ways that matter in terms of you can be who you want to be and you can be what you want to be. And there's not really so much restriction that exists in Ukrainian society during the time that immediately comes after the Maidan Revolution. And so with that kind of freedom, you end up where anybody from any walk of life can have some kind of draw to that free society. That's why generally in the West, so many different types of people move to different countries, is because in free societies, there's an opportunity for you to find your spot there and find that place, right? And when it came to Ukraine, especially during that time, it was seen as the front line of that type of free society in the direct opposition of what we see in contrast inside of countries like Russia.
Yeah. And do you think that that sort of level of freedom is what grew a lot of these sort of militia groups?
Yeah, for sure. So when we really look at the conflict as it developed, specifically from 2014 on, is that the Ukrainian military was in shambles. And there's a few interesting pieces of Ukrainian history during the Maidan Revolution that a lot of people don't know that it's pretty interesting to go over. One of them is the fact that during the Maidan Revolution, the western part of Ukraine had actually seceded from the main government in Kiev on the condition that they would be their own country if the Maidan Revolution failed, and if they succeeded in booting out the more Russian-oriented government, then they would rejoin the Ukrainian state. And so during those weeks of independence around Lviv is that you have really the formation of many militias, most importantly and more structurally compared to different organizations during that time was organization colloquially known as Right Sector, more formally the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps. These guys really formed up, had a strong base out of Lviv, Kiev, and really spread. So if you were generally a militia, you were in any way patriotic, generally your predisposition was you and your guys are going to come in on the side of we're going to fall under Right Sector and do our thing. So the revolution, there's a lot of spotlight on what happened inside of Kiev itself. That was very important. But at the same time, all these different parts of Ukraine were popping up with different events of their own that were really creating a very large paramilitary scene inside the country. With the breakdown in the Ukrainian state, though, what you see is a lot of armories, weapons are not really being accounted for. Old Soviet stocks that have been forgotten have been found by groups that are looking for places to hide out. So they find some old abandoned bunkers, they walk up, and then they find access to various stockpiles of Soviet weapons that have either been forgotten or just left in various states of disrepair to rot. And so really when Russia went into Crimea, that was the first real beckoning call that, hey, we need to get organized really in the paramilitary scene, because the Ukrainian military it's hurting right now, especially when you look at the Donbass conflict. And the Donbass conflict is really the key to understanding a lot about the development of the Ukrainian armed forces, how they do things. Also understanding the history of how large, for example, the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps was in comparison to the Ukrainian armed forces, and how that affects Ukrainian military structure even to this day. And that's a lot to go over just in that little hot pocket of a topic.
Yeah, was there any way you could give us sort of an idea of some numbers, I guess, in 2014 and almost recently, of how that looked?
So 2014, 2015, the Ukrainian armed forces, you're looking at various numbers, but generally agreed upon 3,000 to 6,000 troops are actually able to be committed to combat operations to greater or lesser effect, greater or lesser ability of the officers, to greater or lesser being compromisation. I don't know, having been compromised by either pro-Russian sympathies or actively having agents of the Russian state infiltrate inside these units.
Right.
On top of the culture of corruption that had existed in the Ukrainian armed forces up to that point, a lot of these older units, when they were deployed, they were very slow to react in a lot of cases. This is where a lot of the volunteers getting involved in the conflict, they started to really show up en masse only after the Ukrainian military had already been there. But the Ukrainian military was operating so slowly in a lot of cases that really the volunteers started to take up the spearhead, either though they were arriving from behind, they were arriving generally with a very light weaponry and very little training. And so right sector, the numbers at its peak have it sitting somewhere around 70,000, 75,000 people having been affiliated with the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps at its height. And you can name almost every unit that existed in the Ukrainian armed forces before February 24th, and almost all of them find some kind of lineage that either leads them back to the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps or UNSO or some other type of paramilitary organization that existed in Ukraine fighting the Soviet occupation.
Right. And why do you think that these paramilitaries are sort of synonymous with the right sector?
So it's because Right Sector was the big tent organization. They were the most revolutionary in a lot of ways, but also they were the most accepting. They didn't particularly care what your specific, unique, myopic belief was, just that you cared about Ukraine, changing the country for the better and allowing it to be free and sovereign. Their idea was, after we're done kicking Russia out, then we can decide politics. But for right now, we need to get together and we need to keep ourselves from being invaded. And that kind of overarching theme, where it's a newer organization at this point, it doesn't have baggage yet. And it's very accepting of pretty much everyone right of a communist, essentially. If you're a centrist, fine. Are you Islamic? Don't care. Are you Jewish? Don't care. Are you Christian, pagan? It doesn't matter to them. What matters is just a central objective of, we're going to keep Russia from taking the country over, and then we're going to start talking politics.
Right.
And
And where in that does then sort of like your Bandera stuff fall?
So right sector, definitely when you're a young country like Ukraine, you start to look towards people that you would see as founders. Now, Bandera comes from a particular sect of the Ukrainian insurgent army. There were two sects of the insurgent army during the time of the Russian or Soviet occupation of the Ukraine that were fighting an active resistance. Now, Bandera is regarded as a founding father, but the ideology of right sector is not, for example, if you're looking at their political party versus the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps, um, you'll see oftentimes in Ukraine overlay of terminology. So right sector is there's right sector a political party, and then there's Ukrainian Volunteer Corps right sector, which is not just right sector as a organization. There are many organizations that are contributing to right sector as an organization in terms of the Volunteer Corps. The party, though, being independent and whatnot, there is a lot of, I guess, that they revere about that part of their history, or this resisting the Soviets and whatnot. But I would not say that their ideology as a political party, for example, is specifically Banderist. It's just this was a guy that was fighting for freedom, relatively not so far in the past, but far enough in the past during another flashpoint in our history that we can draw inspiration on. Was Bandera a saint? Nobody is. Neither was George Washington. I mean, all these guys were, people of their time, and so that's kind of that during that phase of time.
Yeah, but within that, does that, I guess, draw on that idea of, I guess, sovereignty and freedom on a lot of the, I guess, Nazi stuff you see?
Yeah, so when we really start seeing and looking into kind of the Nazi or neo-Nazi or scene or whatever you want to call it, is that it's not one entity or thing. Right sector is definitely, even as a political party, really anywhere close to what you would see in like any actual neo-Nazi or National Socialist program, say like Nordic Resistance Front or anything. It's much more closer to what you would see like, I guess, national conservatism. If you were to put it in terms for a easy to understand prospect for an American, is that if you're, Tucker Carlson type conservatism is probably the best way to classify the actual deep held ideological belief and program of right sector, for example. And ultimately, what we see is that because of the loose nature of right sector, the acceptance of so many different ideologies, is that people start to cluster together inside of right sector to different sub-organizations, and then the sub-organizations split off because they're a little bit too right for us. Oh, they like Bandera too much, or they're not good enough for us, or where.
So I think your headphones just cut out there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, so that's where you start to see a lot of your organizations like Azov pop up, Donbass Battalion, even at that time, different foreign, really those very early foreigner groups that got other people from the Eastern Bloc start to become their own thing. And once you exit the very early period of the war is where you enter a phase where Ukraine goes through like a semi painful process where there's a normalization to a degree of the paramilitary organizations.
Right. Well, can you talk to us about that sort of normalization of it? Because, Australia doesn't have really to any degree of paramilitary, and it's a very somewhat foreign concept to myself.
Yeah, for sure. And so, really, when I talk about the normalization, I'm more so talking about a few instances that happen. One is you start eliminating extremely revolutionary elements from different organizations. For example, right sector eliminated a organization known as White Hammer from their ranks because they were still in the mindset that it's the Maidan. We can still kill cops if they ask us for IDs. We can still smuggle cigarettes into the EU for cash. And so you start to see that dividing things up. Um, Organizations are having leadership replaced. You have organizations that are like, hey, owning the Russians and being edgelords online is pretty cool, but if we want to truly help our country, we need to professionalize. We need to, join into some kind of official structure. And even the ones that don't join in any official structure generally come to the agreement that we need to directly coordinate and assist with the military in their operations where and when they need us.
Right.
And we need to prepare for when these guys, when the Russians, because generally the paramilitary seen almost all those people knew, hey, this ceasefire is just a holdover. Russia is going to come. We don't know exactly when, but we need to, get people prepared for when that happens. So really I guess in the U.S., I don't know if you have an equivalent in Australia, but there's like a prepper scene, if it were, preparing for the apocalypse. In Ukraine, the equivalent to that was the preparing for the Russian invasion. So there was always this peripheral X factor of people always praying for the Russian invasion. The amount of munitions and whatnot that were lost during the revolution and the chaos of that, and the amount of organizations that still existed that the Russians never calculated into their plan, where could they maybe have paralyzed the Ukrainian military if they went full force, maybe would, but even Western analysts really didn't have an idea of how entrenched this really paramilitary type scene in Ukraine was. So it was kind of like this major X factor that was less than reliable. You can't count on X factors, but in this case, it really went in Ukraine's advantage because you have a large pool of people that are already experienced, already trained, already armed, already on their own logistics, already prepared for that, ready to pretty much enter the fight immediately. That's why these very long convoys that the Russians are sending, trying to take as much territory as possible, they're not going too well. And it's because you just cross a town where there's like, a dude that's like a veteran of 2014, 2015. He's been out of the game a while, but he always kept his AKM underneath like the floorboard, for example.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting war in that regard, in sort of that civilian paramilitary front. It's been wild.
Yeah. And it's even more wild, really, even when you start looking into the actual structure of the Ukrainian armed forces, is that just because you're a part of an official structure doesn't necessarily mean that your substructure is professionalized to a large degree. So you can have some units where they're really trying to be professional, and you have some units where they're very much so just a paramilitary collecting a check that got a uniform from the government.
Yeah. And where does like Azov fit into this?
Yeah, so Azov initially, like for a brief point, was also part of this early right sector Ukrainian volunteer corps, like almost all organizations. They really have their startup in suppressing the uh, intended Kharkiv People's Republic, which was another People's Republic that Russia wanted to start up. They really wanted to start one in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, all the way down into Odessa. That's kind of take out southern Ukraine. That's going to be, Nova Russia, and then, eventually we'll go and handle the rest of Ukraine. But Azov starts, you have different parts of Azov. Azov itself isn't even entirely one thing or the other. because its foundation is of different groups and organizations based on their territory coming in. So some of the more notorious elements are going to be the guys like the football hooligans out of Kharkiv that went and secured like the city administration from people trying to start essentially what was already going on in Donetsk and Luhansk from happening. Azov really starts to form up. It's real big. First notable event is where a few dozen separatists have taken over Mariupol. Essentially, the Ukrainian military is on the outskirts, just waiting. They're not doing anything. They're not actively going in. They're allowing the enemy to set up fortifications, recruit more dudes locally. Azov at this moment goes into Mariupol, knocks the separatists out, and that's really where they become very notorious, is at that point when they went into Mariupol and secured it. And it's not really a thing where they became notorious because of anything about their beliefs. Ukrainian society, especially at that point, is very free. People can do what they want. We're part of the West. That means there's free. But, you know, it's kind of hard to claim to be like on the front of the world when it's like, oh, well, that only, you know, counts X, Y, and Z. What really makes Azov noteworthy is that they're effective. That's where they really start to get notoriety. Is that after Mariupol, there's a few other campaigns that Azov is involved with, and Russia starts to take notice.
Oh, sorry, just cut out again.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, I was going to say, at this point, Russia is starting to notice as the campaign goes on, they have engagements with Azov. Azov is continuing to, in many ways, professionalize, better outfit its people. And a more dire issue for really the separatists in the region is that it was one thing fighting a very corrupt, standing Ukrainian military. It's a very different thing to be going up against people that are driven by belief, principles, and values. And so the ability to, you know, bribe, for example, somebody from Donbass or Azov battalion, it's just not there. There's not really a corruption issue. So that means when these guys are getting, for example, resources, they're using the resources appropriately. And just due to the state of how things work in Eastern Europe, people take note. And really, when we get down into it, why has Ukraine, from a Western lens, where we're like, hey, these beliefs are unacceptable and whatnot. One of the reasons why it was really hard for Ukraine to give up organizations like Azov, what would become the 46th Battalion, UNSO sections, right sector sections, was quite frankly just there was not as problematic levels of corruption. And so when you have institutions that are formed that aren't suffering and plagued with corruption, and you live in a place where corruption is very common, it's very hard to really try and want to give that up. And that's really the baseline. And so Azov, naturally, they continue to gain notoriety, but there's a shift inside of Azov where they go from this idea that we're this ideological paramilitary to, hey, look, we're fighting the Russians, guys are getting killed, we're learning things. A lot of foreigners are joining Azov because Azov will take them. And Azov will take them because they want to professionalize, and they understand that if they take guys from the West, they're going to be more able to professionalize as a unit. And ultimately that comes into the fruition of, hey, we're not a political thing anymore. You know, at the end of the day, the one thing we all agree on is we care about our country, we love our country. And so it really starts to go through a process of professionalization, and you start to see lines and borders of acceptability laid out inside the unit. People have the right to believe what they want to believe in, but they can't do it outside the purviews of the law. They need to be professionals first and understand what that means. That means that you set aside your personal politics as a professional soldier. You don't have the luxury of that. That's something that you sacrifice. You're, working and to represent Ukraine, because as of, the last thing, if you really care about your country from their perspective, is to be the reason that your country didn't get help when it really needed it. Because there was really a discussion in the West about whether or not aid should be sent to Ukraine at all, because Russia was really pointing out, hey, there's this, these guys out of the Azov, at that time battalion, eventually became a regiment. But when they made those decisions to professionalize, the different units did, they gave guys the option, like guys that were truly there for ideological reasons, guys that were like, hey, we're here for ideological reasons, they gave them the option of go back into civilian life at this point and join in politics, go through the political process if you are truly about that, because our new mission is to professionalize and become an effective unit for defending our country. And so that's kind of a clip note of the evolution of Azov. They're very much so good at making do with whatever they're given. For example, early on in Mariupol, when they went into Mariupol and they secured it, they started essentially like an engineering group inside the unit. And whenever they would get money or resources or materials, they were making their own stuff when they could. Even now, when you look at Ukrainian units, you see a lot of deficiencies in equipment and whatnot, but generally a consistent matter is the fact that units affiliated and surrounded by Azov are generally better outfitted. They generally have better training compared to other Ukrainian units. And that comes from that decision to professionalize, to adopt Western doctrine as close as they could gain parity with, given the resources they had. Because Azov, being inside the Interior Ministry, was actually ignored for a good part of the war after they professionalized in October of 2016. They never got visits from the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government was almost like if we don't see it, it's not there, because they didn't want to show up and it actually be what the media was portraying it in a lot of ways. But naturally, they had their system. They found out, hey, these guys, they've gone through fully with the concept of professionalization over any political derivatives. Actually, what ended up happening is the Minister of Interior of Ukraine, that's not the exact term or direct translation they use, but he visited Azov, and he was actually extremely impressed with the presentation of the unit, the equipment they had, how they were making do with things, how much better the treatment was. I mean, I knew guys that went to some cross training that was kind of sponsored by Azov for other Ukrainian military units, and their food is a lot better because they're actually spending the money on food and not running a racketing scheme like we saw this other minister of defense get knocked for. They are getting issued good ballistic helmets. They're getting issued good body armor. They're actually getting approved to go train. And they're not the only case of this. It's just Russia was really concerned about it because of the scalability of it. Right. Because one of the things in comparison to Ukrainian SSO is that the scalability of these very small specialized teams can be not as profound as the scalability of like a whole regiment structure that was a battalion that has a lot of veterans that would be motivated to go back if war started up. And we see that now where Azov, the National Guard part of it, now has a brigade in the Assault Guard. And then we also see with the Ukrainian Army, the Standard Army, they have a brigade, 3rd Assault, and then they also have a affiliated battalion inside the GUR.
Yep.
So yeah. For just a side note, for Russia's main objective of getting rid of Azov, they've gone really much so in the direction of actually helping them out, because a lot of Ukrainian military units before the invasion were heavily undermanned. People were very demoralized before the 24th of February, but that's another topic.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of, I guess, what percentage though of, I guess, the old guard of Azov was either killed or captured in Mariupol earlier in the 24th invasion?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting to where a lot of those originally old guard guys like Andrei Beletsky, like a lot of your more politically oriented guys, they weren't there.
Right.
You had some old guard guys that had risen through the ranks, but by far it was a lot of newer guys. It was guys that had been trained in that had started their careers in a professionalized Azov that never saw particularly the old guard, this older core of guys. Now naturally they existed. There was a fair number of them still operating the regiment, the ones that decided to professionalize and make that a career, but there was the vast majority of dudes were not in Mariupol with the regiment when things kicked off.
Right. So you don't think, through your experience and research, that the sort of reputation of Azov is what a lot of the media and stuff would portray it to be?
Yeah, and it really comes down to a few things. One, it's a cultural lens. It's really, easy from our perspective and the developments we've had in the West with information and education to point the finger at people that may not have had those same chances, opportunities abroad. But the other thing too is like, it's crazy to me because they're afraid that Azov is this really terrible neo-Nazi organization. They're a threat to other citizens inside Ukraine. But for the longest time, one of the deputy commanders of Azov was a practicing, I believe it was, I don't know which sect of Judaism it was, but it was along those lines where it's like, actually, it's guys that have very strong beliefs, yes, but they aren't operating outside the political system. They're not freelancing it, especially when you get to the 2015, 2016 stage. A lot of the mid 2015 and before stage, a lot more of the information, especially now, is harder to find, and it's a lot more fuzzy. But it's also what information there was very incomplete, didn't show the full picture of things.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That breakdown.
Yeah, really, Azov's a very interesting institution. They're very effective. They're really one of the better organizations if you're Ukrainian to end up with, to be honest. Just because they very early on, in 2015 especially, very much so wanted to professionalize on the standards of NATO. And the cool thing when we really get into Azov, is they understand what works from NATO and what doesn't. So, for example, there was some contract that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and National Guard were going through with where they wanted like a type of RPG-7 that was produced in the West, and it looked cool. It had Picatinny rails. It had a new like paint color. It looked really tactical.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
Yeah, the leader of Azov was like, actually, the ones that we have here have a further effective range, for example. And if we buy these ones from the West, we're not going to be able to outfit all of our units. But if we buy or produce more, of these Soviet types, we'll have, granted a further range, but we'll also be able to outfit everyone properly. And that goes into many things. Azov always has projects to try and improve the body armor they outfit guys. They've produced like invested overall in the defense of Ukraine, that whole perspective, not just on the scope. Specific units, they're very much so interested in to improve Ukraine's defense as a whole. And Ukraine was buying a bunch of from for these Galil offshoots where we're going to, modernize our weapon platform. Went through the process of trying out these weapons and found that there were some pretty major flaws in them. So that's kind of really where they stand.
Sorry, just cutting out again.
My bad.
No, you're right.
But yeah, that's kind of the long and short of Azov. There's some details in between. The other thing too is really when it comes to Ukraine and units like Azov is that they have a very large pagan sect inside of them, and a lot of the symbols and worldview that people have that take very ancestral beliefs can very much so to the Western eye appear to be something that it's not, is what I would say. And that's why there's this disconnect between people there that are working in the Ukrainian government that kind of understand this, and really the West, where people are looking at it and are like, oh, this is something really different than what it actually is. Another thing I'll mention real quickly before we continue is that Ukrainians are always, it's a really strange humor, if I had to put it that way, to where a lot of the pictures of like Azov dudes and many different people like either throwing up the Roman salute or they're holding a Hakenkreuz next to a NATO flag. A lot of that was done ironically because of what Russia was saying about these units. And for better or worse, the general humor of the time was because guys were able to talk to each other. You have guys with smartphones on one side of the line able to communicate directly with guys on the other side. So you got a lot of people that are very pro-Soviet Union. They're being told by Russia, hey, these are Nazis and whatnot. And then to try and like antagonize the enemy, you start seeing them pictures of you and your boys holding up like a Roman salute, or a guy that was like a World War II reenactor or something, and he's got like a old Hakenkreuz flag or something that you can send over to the enemy side, antagonize them, and then they send it up to their guys, and their guys release it like, hey, see, we told you these guys are like the real deal. They're the next coming of Hitler. But the reality of things is much more nuanced in reality. Things are never so clean cut. As you very well know, there's never truly simply just one side of things. There's generally a myriad of facts and nuance that contribute to both sides having a specific kind of quality about them.
Yes. Oh, everything is, yeah. Everything gets summed up on the internet in a photograph or a short video, but everyone knows that everything is far more nuanced than that. You can find photos of Australian soldiers in Afghanistan with swastikas as well if you look hard enough. You don't even need to look very hard. But
they even had a scout sniper unit in the U.S. Marines that thought it would be cool to use runes, and I guess it just never occurred to anyone in the pre-internet age that like, hey, this was like literally the symbol of a paramilitary organization in the 40s. But here's the thing, I will say, naturally, when you're in the military, you're professionalized, you surrender the luxury of politics. But yeah, when we are the West, we are free, people can have these beliefs, is what's important, as long as those beliefs are not entailing the commitment of violence against fellow citizens and other people. Mm. You can very much so in the U.S. go live any way you want to, anywhere you want, as long as that doesn't tread into committing acts of violence against other people. And naturally, what this creates, when you're dealing with more so the paramilitary scene and disorganization, is that, yeah, naturally people that have these beliefs are coming out of the woodwork. that know that they have these freedoms in one country, but not in the country that's trying to invade, naturally they are going to fight for you, because everyone of every type of stripe and banner is going to fight for the side that offers things like freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness, freedom to pursue happiness, because they have that freedom. You're not going to see that necessarily on the Russian side to the same degree, because they don't have that freedom. There's not an option for them to be like, oh yeah, I'll go help Russia. No, because if I go to Russia, I'm going to get in prison for 5 years because, you know, X, Y, and Z belief is considered like a threat to the Russian system, for example.
Yeah. But where does this fall? You know, you talk about, I guess, the freedoms and whatever within Ukraine. What are the counters to that? Because, you know, as I've seen personally in the past month, you know, being deemed an information terrorist, reporting on well within my journalistic rights and on things that I can also back up as truth.
Oh yeah, so what you're seeing here, and this is something I witnessed firsthand, and this is a very important happening in Ukraine, and I think a few foreign fighters have talked about this, is that a lot of the information, the perception of freedom in Ukraine, one that really comes from the Maidan era. Even now with the war, it's like really when people try to draw on the freedom of Ukraine, they really draw on that era. And that was really a different type of era, because you really had an era before Poroshenko, and the government's kind of in chaos, and you have things under Poroshenko, and then you have how things get when Zelenskyy comes into power, and really what all that was about. And this is really kind of where things really start to get goofy, especially having been over there, because I was there first when Poroshenko was in office, and it was one type of country, and then I came back and Zelenskyy was in office, and there's this major shift in Ukrainian society, and it was changing very rapidly into something that I didn't recognize. It wasn't the country that I had fallen in love with. It wasn't I had fought for initially. I still loved Ukraine. I still love the people. I still love Ukraine very much. So it's reobtained a lot of the spirit that it had lost. Was one.
Sorry, you just cut out there about 30 seconds ago. Basically saying you still loved Ukraine, but you feel like something was lost.
Yeah. So really, I still love Ukraine. Really, a lot was lost when Zelenskyy came in, and that comes from, people need to understand, for example, Zelenskyy was elected as a appeasement candidate to Russia. And in addition to that, he was funded in Ukraine by people that wanted rapprochement with Russia. Koshalinsky, the ex-head of Privyat Bank in Ukraine, was the primary real bankroller and force behind getting Zelenskyy into the presidency. Zelenskyy early on, I mean, he's a Russian speaker, like where he is now and whatnot. I don't know. Like I said, none of this really has anything to do with kind of what's going on post 24th of February, but some of the symptoms that were being presented to us currently also have origins from when Zelenskyy really was first coming into office. And some of the differences were, from just a military perspective, when Poroshenko was in, if your life was under threat, if you were taking fire from Russian positions, you could defend your life. If a unit took a position, for example, it wasn't considered illegal or a bad thing, because that is Ukrainian territory, was the view of the Poroshenko regime. But the most important thing under the Poroshenko regime, though it was very much so imperfect, it suffered from corruption in the very top classes. Corruption in many other instances had really gone away and didn't really boil up again until Zelenskyy came back into office. The big thing that one second, my bad. The big thing that there was under Poroshenko was a consensus with the military. a consensus of what are our objectives and goals. And that was things like, we're reforming the military, we're improving equipment, we're going to continue to improve pay, we're going to improve the conditions for our soldiers. That means building new buildings for them to live in, improving the quality of food, and improving benefit packages. So there's a lot more consensus under Poroshenko in comparison to Zelenskyy, because under Zelenskyy, it was very much so, what do we need to do to appease Russia so that way they don't invade us? And that was everything from, you no longer have the right to defend yourself on the front line. You have guys getting killed because they don't have any bullets on them, because if they fail to uphold the silence regime, they either had ammunition confiscated from their position, or they were court-martialed, or they were having their paychecks taken away. And so essentially you have guys where, because they returned fire, they had Russian DRGs that were going up and trying to, take dudes and whatnot. If they returned fire and killed someone, they were held responsible for it in a way that was very punitive. And in the consensus on the military is no longer there. You're not seeing pay raises anymore. You're not seeing new equipment programs. You're not seeing an improvement in equipment. You're also actually seeing the reverse in some cases. For example, under Poroshenko, there's a new nutrition program put into place to try and improve the quality of food for the Ukrainian military. That went away under Zelenskyy. They stopped that program. In addition to stopping that program, many other strategically important things were just thrown under the bus. Renewing contracts, not really needed. Also under Zelenskyy, part of the appeasing Russia is Russia doesn't like when foreigner dudes go to Ukraine, because one, it plugs them a little bit more into the West, typically the guys that the Westerners are surrounded by. And secondly, especially guys that are coming that have solid NATO training experience, and couple that with dudes that have that are also competent, showing up and teaching Ukrainians these skills, how to implement certain things. Russia was not about that. So under the Zelenskyy regime, you actually see the change of things to a less very pro-Western thing for foreign guys. By far, under Zelenskyy, you see many such guys that Russia had on their radar, that had identified them as people that Russia wanted gone, are getting banned from Ukraine. They're getting detained by SBU and forcibly deported from the country. By SBU through my...
Oh, sorry, can you just step back to the bit about forcibly evicted from the country by the SBU?
Yeah. So go like more in detail about it?
Oh, no, so you just cut out for about 20 seconds.
Oh, my bad.
No, you're right.
Oh, my bad. So yeah, guys are getting forcibly evicted by the SBU from the country and banned. You have guys that are just traveling and they're getting banned by migration services for 3 years. And this is specifically happening to foreigners that were put onto the radar by Russia, guys that had been on either some kind of military interview with the Ukrainian government, that Russia was like, hey, any way that we can like get these people out of the country and not to come back is going to be great. And you really saw that in the way of taking the most fanatical supporters of Ukraine, guys that were really about it, they're not allowed back in the country, for example, 3-year periods, which is max amount, for example, SBU and migration services can do. I was actually talking to a guy recently that one of the symptoms of that kind of policy where they were doing that to foreign guys that fought there is a guy that showed up to Ukraine in February before the invasion that I've been talking with. He went to the border a few months, and they basically told him that he wasn't going to be able to come back in if he left, because he had entered the country before the invasion started, even though he had fought formally with the Ukrainian military and all of that. Like, these are a lot of guys that have their documents, have their papers. You have some guys that don't, but it's something that's still going on now when there's an excuse to have it go on for some reason.
Right. Yeah, it seems counter to a lot of the stuff. Like, it seems like Zelenskyy is super pro-Ukrainian, and like the sort of pro-Ukrainian mindset of being absolutely allowed to flourish in Ukraine, but shutting down other things, where you're almost saying it's different to that.
Yeah, especially before the invasion.
Right.
Uh, Before the invasion, pro-Ukrainian outfits and people are getting antagonized by the police. They're getting arrested. You have a lot more pro-Russian sympathetic people getting the power. You're starting to see corruption come back in various government institutions. And it's one of the reasons that his approval rating dropped fairly rapidly. It only increased because of the war. And if you want my opinion, I don't mean to insult anyone. I don't know any situation, but I have a feeling that it's very much so that either Zelenskyy felt like, hey, I have really fucked up in the policies I've been promoting and making our country super vulnerable to Russia, or the military was like, hey, buddy, you made us super vulnerable to Russia. We could have been like way more ready than we are right now had we just even stuck with what we were doing. And so a lot of what we're seeing is either him trying to make up.
Sorry, you just cut out at about a minute ago. It just said him trying to, like, Zelenskyy trying to make up.
Yeah, essentially just trying to make up for the policies that kind of made Ukraine vulnerable to this invasion, that emboldened Russia enough to where they truly thought that due to the policies that were occurring under the Zelenskyy regime, that the pro-Ukrainian sentiment had, for the most part, been reset to pre-2014 levels, that the paramilitary scene had been paralyzed along with the military programs, essentially making it where nobody wants to join the military because it's a stagnant outcome, for example. And the paramilitary scene, all the volunteer units, they become much smaller. Almost everyone's back in civilian life. This is one of really the reasons that Russia feels like it can just like jump into Ukraine, because all these people that surrounded Zelenskyy, I mean, if we look at the leader of the SBU, sympathies with Russia. You have SBU officers killing themselves because they're being caught for having sympathies with Russia. The SVU was heavily infiltrated by Russian sympathizers and Russian agents, especially in the Zelenskyy regime with all the reforms that were going on, to try and be more approachable to Russia. The one thing I will say, for better or worse, is that regardless of whether or not NATO was provoking Russia is another story, but if there's one thing I'm sure of, is that Zelenskyy was having everyone bend backwards to try and have some kind of dialogue and reapproachment with Russia. We saw that in the cost of lives on the front line. We saw that in people having the lives they had built in Ukraine uprooted because Russia had them on their radar as being like problematic to creating kind of ceasefire. Because one of the things Russia preconditioned in the Minsk ceasefires was that Ukraine would not allow foreign fighters on the line.
Right. But now it seems like there's been a big shift rearwards in that, because now Zelenskyy and his government it's seeming like will not have any dialogue with Russia, and are really wanting foreign fighters to come across, almost, well, to the point of promoting foreigners to come across.
For sure. And it's one of those things where I always think, what if, like, had they not gone through the policy they did, where you probably would have had something more resembling a foreign legion for guys, all these new guys that were showing up to fall under, but it's here or there. But yeah, it's a complete reversal, because now the military has a lot more authority and say. The military itself as an institution was always for dudes from the West coming over. If you were motivated, that was the quality they looked for. They were great. Like, guys that didn't have training, but had the motivation to undergo training before the war. The military loved those guys. Guys with training from NATO countries, the military loved them too. Like, the Ukrainian armed forces genuinely love the guys coming from the West. Now, granted, that started to change again under the Zelenskyy regime. You started to have different things that were occurring that made the environment less ideal for guys that were from the West. And so that's kind of a dynamic. And then also not speaking with Russia. Yeah, I mean, I think it's because people that were there before the war, a lot of these veterans, a lot of these guys that are in the military currently, is that it wasn't so long ago that their president was bending over backwards to try and obtain some kind of peace with Russia, to the degree that you have guys getting killed because they're not allowed to return fire. They don't have any ammunition at their position. And, you know, a DRG on the other side is going to take advantage of that.
Yeah, right. And can you talk to me about, you mentioned something with the FSB being like the Russian intelligence working amongst the SBU, or at least getting like sort of agents within?
Yep. So the SBU is a very overstaffed organization for the type of outfit it is. It is very manpower intensive for what it is, and it is a institution that has some very solid people. A lot of the guys that are in the SBU that end up like line units that are doing like military intelligence around like the ATO and OOS or OOC are very solid dudes. But a lot of the guys that are kind of lurking in the back and whatnot, there's a lot less oversight over them. And they're pretty much allowed to have a lot more free reign over things. And that includes the amount of influence that guys from Russia are able to have over operatives in the SBU. Even when you have, and this really expressed under Zelenskyy, because the guy he had in charge of the SBU had so many pro-Russian sympathies that Zelenskyy had to remove them. So a lot of the pro-Russian elements inside the SBU felt very emboldened, because if that's one thing Russia always excelled at, is that it was infiltration, putting people inside the Ukrainian government that were people on their side, for example. And that is one of the reasons there's been such a problematic deal with SBU. But
It's cut out, really, when you began talking about like Russian infiltration.
Okay. Yeah, so Russian infiltration in the SBU is pretty deep. They've always been there, and they've been there for a while. Since really Ukraine was an independent state, infiltrating the SBU was kind of always their thing. That's one of the reasons you have such a problematic thing with the SBU in the past. So granted, things are changing, like the dynamic is changing, but if we look at kind of how things got when Zelenskyy was first president, how bad they got, and the reality of them for most people, especially those who were most pro-Ukrainian. And then you see some residual effects of that into the invasion.
So I guess like in your experience, say you were looking at my case as someone who has, you know, fairly deep ties back into Ukraine, would you say that there is any danger for someone like myself being pointed out like that?
So here's the thing, right? So not to be the bearer of scare tactics or anything like that, is that I genuinely think, given the state of things in Ukraine, that people would be more than willing to, you know, defend me. So the problem is...
Sorry, you just cut out there just as you said the answer.
Hopefully it stays in for a sentence or two.
That's all right.
The major thing that we saw recently was a gentleman who had switched sides from Russia to Ukraine get kidnapped by people pretending to be SBU in Kiev, and then taking him to Belarus, and then hand him over to Wagner to have a video filmed of him having his head like sledgehammered. That's really where you start to come into more of a risk, is those types of things, because if some National Guard kid that's 17 years old holding down a block post in like northern Kiev that stops your vehicle going to be like, oh, this SBU document that's been professionally forged isn't real? or is he gonna be like, oh, this is like fucking SBU, go right ahead.
Right.
So
So I guess
those are
on my case, what do you think of that?
honestly, I don't foresee any situation where they would realistically try and take a journalist. But then again, they don't always do things that are logical. It's like they had infiltrated Ukraine so thoroughly before February that there was probably no real reason to invade the country. They could have just waited a few election cycles and had, like, you know, half the country handed over to them anyway. But the it's hard to say, right? It's just like you have to keep your eyes open. One of the things with knowing the language is, like, if you are stopped by like guys from the SBU, if they're legitimately SBU, they will speak proper Ukrainian. Most of them have been educated in Western Ukraine. SBU has tried to recruit from there. Now there are some Russian speakers, but if you generally come across an SBU agent that doesn't know the Ukrainian language, you might want to try and drag your feet a little, for example.
Yeah.
Just stuff like that. It's just such a hard and dynamic situation from the point of when are you actually dealing with these organizations and when are you dealing with someone that just has the resources to professionally.
So I guess the next point we'll go into is, what are your plans? Are you going to return to Ukraine?
Right now, it's I'm continuing to develop my training and education. I want, if and upon my arrival, I would like to have more advanced medical interventions I would be able to do. I'm a medical guy. I very much so would like to see a situation in which I could go back and be a line medic, or I think really right now with TCCC, what they're calling it is a combat paramedic. I really want to get that paramedic certification, have access and knowledge of all those medications and advanced interventions, but I also want to get a course or two in extended austere pre-hospital care, so that way I can really excel in a lot of the circumstances that you find in Ukraine where you're dealing with 6 and 8 hour, medevacs.
Yeah. Did you have a want to go back earlier? Now we're well over a year of war, and someone who's experienced the war there multiple times, multiple tours of duty. Did you feel funny not going back for this first year?
No, I didn't. I was very not okay with it. I very much so wanted to go back. The problem is that, due to kind of what we talked about, the conditions of my return, the stability of that, and whatnot, would not make it something that I would be particularly fond of. Not fond of, but I wouldn't feel like it's one of those things where I would go there, and if I'm not going there the proper way, then I just end up stuck outside the country. And so I want to enter the correct way. I want to go through the whole process. It's been very painful to be here, safe and comfortable, reading reports of guys I served with dying. And it was very painful early on in the war because of the amount of guys that were dying, commanders, friends. It's not something I've been okay with at all, but I also, understanding the depth of the situation, don't want to create any circumstances which would jeopardize any of those guys I would be serving around. Because at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that if you're a Westerner, you can just leave. And one of the things with the Foreign Legion is that kind of creates, for all that's wrong with it, a less appreciated part of it is that helps to give a lot of governments oversight and protections for their citizens in the event of whatever happens, to the greatest degree that there could be, with many flaws. But that's kind of my piece on that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess it's a difficult one for you. Where do you see this war going this year?
This is the beginning of a war that will probably develop into more wars, to be honest. If Russia wins in Ukraine, they're going to go for a NATO country next. They're going to try and rebuild. They're going to try and finish plugging up, because what we need to understand really about Eastern Europe is that they are in a demographic predicament. These guys, because of their low birth rates, drug use, alcoholism, high abortion rates, have been below replacement level for a very long time. It's a demographic collapse as a ticking time bomb in Russia and Ukraine. This war is accelerating that. Russia doesn't have the people to lose like it did in World War II, where they could just waste tens of millions, charting German and Italian and Romanian positions. They really can't afford it like they used to. The way that they're trying to justify affording it now is by trying to take the lower, rungs of society and using them first, and then going one tranche up at a time. So when we really get into Russian philosophy, they really believe in there's leaders and then there's peasants. There's those two levels of society, and that really comes from back, I guess, in the Dark Ages. But if Ukraine wins, it will be Russia being expelled from Ukraine, but it will not stop there, because Ukraine would have to dismantle Russia's ability to strategically rebuild its military to prevent it from going cross-border raids. And so that would require quite a few strikes inside Russia. There will also probably be a general collapse of the Russian system between different oligarchs, companies, regions, and ethnic groups trying to obtain autonomy and insulate themselves from what would be happening inside Russia. Right. In the event of a Ukrainian victory.
Where do you think this is going to lie, though, in the next year or so? Do you think that we will see a Ukrainian or a Russian victory?
I foresee we'll know more in the spring when the fighting season really kicks in. The ground hardens. It's easier for infantry to move without heavy packs because they won't freeze to death if they just bring a lighter combat load. So you'll have more mobility in that sense. And it's also much easier to spot things like tripwires and mines when there's not 2 feet of snow on the ground. So things will get a lot more mobile then. We'll have some of the equipment of the West has been promising, more Ukrainians trained by the West, a lot of units reconstituting. The Ukrainian army is rapidly expanding as well to accept in guys trained by the West. So I can actually send you a link to a pretty good resource, but they keep updated on all the units that are being created. Brigade after brigade after brigade is being formed up. Ukraine is very much so rapidly increasing the size of its military. So there's that to account for. It's extremely hard to say before we see really how this summer goes, because if this summer is indecisive, it means both countries are going to keep building up. It's going to be until Russia collapses or Ukraine collapses.
Right.
So it's an absolute mess for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. Well, mate, is there anything else you feel like we've left out of this talk so far?
I think we've generally gone over it. I mean, maybe some other time we'll be like, hey, maybe we could talk about this. I mean, Ukraine's an interesting place. I definitely think it's going to be interesting when the election cycle goes around there, because you've gone from an environment where Russia had a lot of influence on the internal side of Ukraine, given the leniency of the peacetime institutions there. Now you're entering a stage where if Ukraine has elections, you're going to see, I would love to say unadulterated outcomes, but I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that international intelligentsia from the US, the UK, and other Western countries isn't going to be trying to put up guardrails on who's going to end up in power in Ukraine when that happens. Because if there isn't a definitive victory under Zelenskyy and they refuse to talk to the Russians and the Russians try to continue this fight, you're very much so looking at a situation where it might be who can find the most competent leader first to try and reorganize and restructure things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an incredibly messy situation and across the whole war. And it is incredibly complex.
For sure. And one of my biggest fears is with Western aid is that there's a lot of promise behind it. If it's given to guys that have gone through reform, they've gone through education, they understand how to use it. But if you've got officers that are using lazy tactics and they blame it on the fact that they don't have the newest, shiniest tank, and then when they do end up with the newest, shiniest tank and they use the same tactics and those tanks get destroyed, what is it then? My hope is very sincerely that Ukraine manages to consolidate and effectively use these things and make sure, and I'm sure they will. I'm sure they're going to try at least to put their more competent officers, because Ukraine does have some extremely competent dudes, but I mean, Ukraine is a land of extremes. You see that in politics, you see that in the fighting, you see that in the brutality of this war. In all things, I mean, the extremes in all fronts, and that also includes things in the military, like competence, for example. Like, I've met probably some of the most competent officers I've met in the world have been Ukrainian officers, but the most incompetent people I have probably met in the world have also been Ukrainian officers. So it's one of those things. Like I said, a lot of this is critique of their system, but the big important thing is they're fighting. You have a lot of good dudes out there doing that, and really giving the Russians a run for their money. Those guys should, keep doing the good work. They also need to understand that a lot rests on their shoulders, specifically these younger officers that have more training and dynamic experience working with NATO doctrine and understanding how to hybridize that in their specific situation. That this war is really going to end up resting on their shoulders, because these generals, especially the ones that are left over from the Soviet era that still think like that, I mean, we know that Ukraine's not going to win playing that game.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. There's so many moving parts in this, isn't there?
All right, so.
Oh, sorry, I said there's so many moving parts in this. It's incredibly complex.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I really think that's about everything there is to go over at the current point.
Well, mate, look, I really appreciate it. I'm sure my audience will really appreciate your experience and opinions and knowledge on the situation, especially that lead up period, I guess, from really the late teens, into, I guess, the beginning of the war, gives a lot more context to a lot of stuff. And I think you've been very unbiased in a lot of what you've told me.
Yeah, I try. I mean, the big thing is the major flaws that the Russians have fallen into is that they believe their own propaganda. And if we want to obtain the same results that they've had in this war, we would have to do the same, but for our home. So it's always good to understand each side why they're doing it. I understand where the Russians are coming from. I understand their mentality. I also, in that same sense, it's why I find it kind of disgusting that even their own government can't just be honest with their people why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's no better when it's on our side. Like, we can very much so tell people the truth of why we need to win this, and people will be okay with that explanation.
Mm. Yeah, believing your own propaganda is very, very dangerous.
Very much so.
Yeah.
If I believe hard enough.
Yeah. Well, mate, look, thank you very much. I do really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem, boss man. Happy to help.
Righto, man. Well, I'll speak to you soon, but again, thank you.